Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted to be here today with my colleagues from Climate Bonds, as well as my colleagues and friends from IIGCC, E3G, and GFANS. We're going to be talking today about how we can finance the energy transition. This is part of the EU Sustainable Energy Week, and I'm very grateful to be working with them on this webinar. We're live streaming, so just the normal housekeeping rules for my colleagues on the call. If you're not speaking, please keep yourself muted. And we'll dive straight in. So my name is Rachel Hemingway. I'm the head of the transition program here at the Climate Bonds Initiative. I'm joined today by two colleagues from the Climate Bonds Initiative, as well as colleagues and friends from E3G, IIGCC, and GFANS. So I'd like to welcome Anna Creed, our Director of Thought Leadership here at Climate Bonds, who's been working on frameworks of financing the energy transition and frameworks for sustainable finance for a number of years at Climate Bonds now. My colleague Ana Diaz, who is our Global Energy Transition Lead, developing pathways and measures to decarbonize the global energy system. Ronan Hodge, who is the technical lead for the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, who works on net zero transition planning, analysis of the energy transition and its implications for the financial sector. Leo Donaghy, who is the Sustainable Finance Lead at the IIGCC Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change. Leo leads IIGCC's work on sustainable finance, overseeing the development of policy positions at the national, EU and international levels. And last but absolutely not least is Svetlina Kuzmanova from E3G. She is a sustainable policy advisor on sustainable finance. E3G is a climate change think tank working to accelerate a global transition to a climate-safe world. So the reason we're all here today is the impacts of climate change are becoming ever more pronounced. We have wildfires in Canada as we speak. The smoke is blanketing the whole of the North Americas. There's a heat dome over the south of North America that is affecting hundreds of thousands of people there. And there's flooding and drought and climate chaos around the world. Now, the energy transition underpins the whole of the transition. Without a clean and sustainable energy system, it's very difficult to transition our wider economies. So the industrial sectors, buildings, transport, all rely on a clean and sustainable energy system. Finance is crucial for this transition, which is why we're all here today. We want to talk about how to get finance flowing to where it needs to go. Now, we have a very tight schedule, so I will ask people to pop questions into the Q&A, and we'll try and get to them at the end. We do have about 30 minutes at the end of the webinar to get to any questions that the audience members may have. So please feel free to put them in at the end, and we will get to them as we can. First, though, I would like to invite my colleague Anna Creed, our Director of Thought Leadership, to kick us off with the tools that she has developed to support 1.5 degrees pathways to Paris. Welcome, Anna.
Lovely, thank you, Rachel. Yeah, and thanks for the slide. So yes, so nice to meet you all. I'm very happy to be here today talking about some of the work CBI has been doing. And my colleague, the other Anna, is going to follow up straight after me to go into more detail for you. So basically, for those of you that don't know, Climate Bonds' mission is to mobilise the capital markets to finance the transition to a low carbon and a resilient economy. And that's across all sectors of the economy, including obviously the energy sector, but not limited to that. If we're really going to reach our net zero goals, all sectors are going to need to play a part. That is including the high emitters that need to reorientate their activities away from stranded activities. and those sectors and activities that need to decarbonise production of essential goods and services such as cement, food production, etc., including through the use of climate solutions. So we have developed over the years, not all me, some of them predate me as well, but we have a number of tools to help investors, to help issuers of labelled instruments, to help all sorts of stakeholders in this market to identify what is credible, green, transition, resilience, blue, whatever, but what is a credible investment. And really that's what we talk about today, because obviously in the transition space, we're trying to still work out not just what is credible, but how that is demonstrated as well. So both aspects of that. So just before I go into the tools, just a bit of background on the financing side more generally. So obviously I've given an example, if you can go to the next slide, please, with the circles. Here from the energy utility perspective, essentially. So we've got various elements or layers of transition that need to be financed, and we can use a variety of instruments for that. So we can see that we have measures to reduce emissions, and they might be, so this might be projects or project financing, essentially. So we've got, you could stop gas flaring, you could phase out fossil fuels, you could upgrade the gas networks, just generally you could be changing bits of kit inside various energy sources to decarbonise it. And all of these kind of things, what we call measures or projects or interventions, they can be financed via a variety of instruments like green loans, green bonds, use of proceeds bonds, asset-backed securities, transition bonds. We're quite flexible at CBI about the words green and green transition, because in our view, transition needs to be 1.5 degree aligned. It just recognises that somebody is not, so it is very much a green transition. So I might use those words green and transition interchangeably, but we're very much talking about 1.5 degree aligned pathways for all of this. But there's a lot of different instruments out there that can be used to finance those kind of interventions and measures. Those same instruments can be used to raise finance for measures at the kind of higher activity level. So you could finance the installation or construction of a whole renewable energy facility, or upgrading your distribution network. So that's a sort of a higher level intervention using those kind of financing tools. And then you've got obviously the assessment of a whole entity. So for an electric utility, are your emissions low carbon enough? Are you transitioning away from fossil fuels fast enough, for example? In which case you could, if you can demonstrate that, then your equity arguably is green or transition. You could issue sustainability linked bonds where your KPIs and your performance targets are linked to that kind of transition that you're making in a credible transition plan, or you could have a general purpose bond as well. So actually there's a variety of ways that you can finance the transition once people can demonstrate they are actually got credible targets and a credible plan for that transition. So with that in mind, just on the next slide, just highlighting three sort of different tools that CBI has. One is our climate bond standard certification scheme. This is kind of a fair trade type labelling scheme for labelled instruments and corporates. So where we see green bonds, transition bonds, SLBs. So use of proceeds instruments, green loans, SLBs, all sorts of things that are labelled as either green or social or sustainable. We will be able to certify some or all of those depending on the stage of the criteria development. And basically to get certified, it requires assurance from an approved verifier that the criteria in the climate bond standard and the relevant sector criteria are met. That's kind of a gold standard. The value of obtaining certification to those who are getting certified, say a corporate, enables them to demonstrate their high environmental credentials, and to investors enables them to identify investments with high environmental credentials. They basically just need to look for the certification mark, essentially, to see that this has all been done up front. So it reduces a bit of friction in the market. So we're very transparent about our criteria. We work with technical working groups to develop them, so they're scientifically robust and feasible. And this can all be done up front with external third-party assurance that we oversee through the certification scheme. And it gives that kind of credibility on a one-to-one basis with the instruments or the entities that we're certifying. What we also do, on the second layer of this diagram, is regardless of whether things are screened or not, everything that is issued in the market that is labelled in some way as green or social or sustainable or transition or blue or resilience, we screen those things. So we look out for any sort of a label like that, and we evaluate whether we consider it to be sufficiently green or not. And if it is, if we don't think there's greenwashing going on and sufficient information has been provided publicly to be able to evaluate that, then we will include it in our various databases. And then that data is provided to climate bond partners and index providers as well, which is quite critical because it feeds a lot of the indices that investors are buying into. This obviously has a lot of value because we're using a consistent, transparent methodology to evaluate all labelled instruments, and we provide that data to the market either directly to our partners or via the indices. Some indices use that data as it is, some of them apply their own screens on top, but it feeds into quite a lot of the green or other labelled indices as well. And then at the third layer, we provide sort of guidance for people that might want to do their own bespoke assessments. So we have various documents, we can provide various advice and support to those making their own assessments of transition. So we do all those kind of things. And just digging in very quickly to the standard and certification scheme. So we used to only certify use of proceeds bonds, but as of April this year, we've launched a new standard version 4, and now we can certify assets independent of any financial instrument. We can certify sustainability-linked debt, so sustainability-linked bonds or loans, where the performance targets are linked to something credible. And we certify entities. There is an asterisk on that. At the moment, we're talking about non-financial corporates. We are working at the moment on the rules for financial institutions and public bodies. We obviously want to see, we've seen a lot of financial institutions make commitments to net zero, and we want to have rule sets and methodologies and assessment frameworks to evaluate the credibility of those and give the assurance scheme and the labelling scheme to those as well. And same with public bodies, particularly for SLBs. We see a lot of sovereigns issuing SLBs. So we're going to come up with the rule sets to also be able to certify and evaluate those. And by extension, if your entity has been certified, then we have a streamlined process that we can recognise and certify general purpose debt or any labelled instruments that are linked to certified entities.
Just one more minute, Anna, sorry.
Okay, cool, only 2 slides left. This very briefly is an overview of the elements that were assessed for transitioning corporates. So if it was an electric utility coming to us to get certified at the pre-certification stage, this is what we would look at. So we look at their climate performance targets and whether they meet the climate bond standard sector criteria for utilities. And we also look at their transition plan in quite a lot of detail. I say we, I mean our approved verifiers, that we run a pool of approved verifiers. They will really look under the hood. This is not just public information. They look at private information as well with the company about the action plan, the finance plan, internal policy, the governance, etc. And also around the disclosure that they're providing on that, which will probably be a higher level of information with less detail in it. But they look at all of that. And essentially then, just to tee up the other Anna quite quickly, this slide just shows the last slide with the purple. Oh, we've lost your screen, Barney. Okay, the last slide, if we can pick that up, basically shows that we have done a lot of work in the energy sector so far. So we've developed a lot of criteria for renewable energy assets and companies. And now Anna is working on, with our technical working group, the criteria for electric utilities who obviously have a mix of fossil fuel and renewables, hopefully shifting towards renewables rapidly, but that's what the criteria are trying to dictate. So we are working on those criteria at the moment. So that's it for me. Thanks, Rachel.
Beautiful segue, Anna Creed, over to Anna Diaz, who is actually working on the technical criteria and pathways that will guide the energy transition, telling us what is credible and what can be considered 1.5 degree aligned. So over to you, Anna Diaz. Perfect. You're on mute.
Thank you so much. Sorry for that. So I want to say thank you for being here. I'm delighted to be sharing this time with you, with all of you. And thank you, Anna, for introducing me. So I'm Anna Diaz. So I'm developing the electricity utility criteria that will be certified, qualified electricity companies as aligned to 1.5. This is what I'm doing. So now I'm going to give you a bit hint of the kitchen. I'm going to show you how we are cooking this criteria, what is behind the criteria. So follow me. So this is simply emission pathway for climate targets, just to show you the magnitude of the challenge that we are facing. This is the magnitude of the challenge. So this should be also the magnitude of the ambitious solution, what is required to decarbonize the electricity system. The mitigation of climate change will mostly depend on the pace of action the companies, investors, policymakers, and us as consumers will take in the next 2 or 3 decades. And to support this is why the criteria are being developed. Given the scale of the problem, given the scale of the solution, so global energy-related emissions have been on rise since the time of Industrial Revolution and are reaching new high year after year. But it's not only that, and we can see here emission concentration at the atmosphere is rising. So we have this data for last April is 4,023 parts per million. So this is growing and nothing has been able to stop it until now. So what are the key milestones in transforming? So how are we facing this major transformation that we need to do? So to develop the criteria, we base science-based knowledge, so based on the net zero by IA, also the IPCC report, and we will follow the key milestone with some cooking inside CBI, so like advanced economies should be net zero in aggregate in 2035, emerging market and developing economies in 2040, phase out also critical, so the worst less efficient coal power plants by 2030, phase out an abated coal fire plant and oil fire and gas by different data. So we are facing this problem and we are using something like that in order to develop our criteria, where we will come with some milestone together. So this is a flavor how we do it. Like, for example, we will separate between new capacities investment or existing capacity. So here what you see on the screens are the new capacities, so the candidate for automatic inclusion into the criteria, like based on a life cycle analysis, of course, we account for the emissions and we will set milestone. Like, for example, solar should be 100 grams per kilowatt hour life cycle analysis approach by 2020, and then it should be going down until 2050 will to reach zero, and the same for the other candidate to be automatically inclusive. So that will be the approach, and we will study each of them and say go or not go depending of the emissions. In the other side, we have also candidate for automatic power plant exclusion. That should be the fossil fuel. So we don't allow new investment in fossil fuel. It may be some room to make some differentiation between geographically speaking, like advanced economies or the rest of the world. Do they do it first? There will be some time room, but this is the thing that we are setting together with a technical working group, and that will be published, and we will for public consultation at the end of the year, and then it will be public at the beginning of 2024. So those are the candidates. The thermal plants, of course, to be automatically excluded from the criteria. What else? What happened with the existing capacity? For example, for fossil fuel existing capacity, we are checking with the technical working group whether we need to phase out them, when, how. Of course, we know that coal phase out has the greatest reduction potential, but we also know that thermal electricity generation can be covered by renewable, but the capacity and system services require other technologies together. So you cannot just phase out coal and put renewable. You need to provide the system with energy storage, a smart grid in order to provide the required services. Again, we will provide within the criteria phase out data for phasing out unabated fossil fuels and geographically differentiation between advanced economy or not, and this is all the thing that we are testing, and that will be the key, the core of the criteria for the different technologies at the electricity system. Again, what happened also with existing capacity? You can phase out then, but of course you can do it gradually. You don't need to do everything at the time. So of course there are some mitigation technologies that we are considering within the criteria as carbon capture and storage. What are the criteria behind the carbon capture and storage? How can we use it? In which condition? Low carbon co-firing, again, the same. How, when? There are some geographies that need to do that or not. Are we making differentiation or not? This is the kind of question that we will answer and we will provide within the criteria. Fossil fuel switching, the same. Is worth it? Is not worth it? Increasing in energy performance efficiency probably is not enough to reduce the emission requirement, because don't forget the major challenge that we have. That's why I showed you the first slide. So maybe that's not enough. Again, you will see in the criteria something like coal plants that run past 2040, for example, will be required to be retrofitted and starting in 2030, and maybe not, or co-fire with some percentage. So this is the kind of thing that you will expect in the criteria. Repurpose base load into peak could happen, or gas-fired peak plants used as a backup generation. Are we going to limit in the kilowatt installed per nation? Are we going to limit the kilowatt generated per year? This is the kind of question I will be answering in the criteria. So,
just 2 minutes left, Anna.
I'm doing that. It might
Great.
be, so this is a summary, in fact, of the technology generation that are included in the criteria. So we have low carbon assets with there should be some life cycle approach milestone, and then there should be also some specific measure activities or expenditures in carbon capture, low carbon, fossil fuels, etc. So you can expect to have some criteria for each of those, and of course, no new investment for business expansion in fossil fuels. But this is not all, of course, because we have an entity approach, as my colleague Anna mentioned. So we will provide with a emission reduction pathway for the company. So this is an example where you have here advanced economy in the light green, and in the dark green will be the rest of the world. So we are giving some emission reduction pathway. They are all aligned with 1.5. All of the pathways here are aligned. So we can have some approach in terms of whether a company is within the limit. It will be aligned. It will be already aligned with the 1.5. So, or a company that is not aligned, but we provide some flexibility in order to be aligned before 2030, like because we analyze their plans, their budget, the infrastructure, what they're expecting to do, and we want to provide with some transition qualification for this company. So this is how we will use the emission reduction pathways. So this is all from my side. Thank you very much. And I give it over to you, Rachel. Thank you.
Perfect, and right on time as well. And I have to say that last slide links very nicely with what Ronan is going to talk about, which is transition plans and how to translate net zero commitments into science-based transition plans. So Anna, you mentioned this forward-looking, these plans that the entities need to have in order to demonstrate how they will change over time. So I will pass over to Ronan from GFANZ now, who's going to talk a little bit more about this subject.
Thanks very much. Good morning. Thanks for inviting me to speak today. Ronan Hodge from the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ. I'm trying to just describe, I suppose, the work that we're doing to help not only the financial sector, but the whole economy translate those net zero commitments that have been made in recent years into ambition action and through those science-based transition plans and pathways that we've just touched on. So just very quickly, for any of them unfamiliar with GFANZ, we launched in April 2021 to support the UN's non-state commitments to net zero. We bring together leading financial institutions committed to net zero through 8 sector-specific alliances, and those cover the full breadth of the financial ecosystem. And this membership of those has grown to more than 550 firms now across 50 jurisdictions and represent about 40% of global financial assets. And our main role in GFANZ Secretariat is to help provide those financial institutions with the tools and the frameworks and guidance to make good on those commitments. So core to this we see is transition planning. And this is describing really the goals, the actions, and the accountability mechanisms that will see an organisation support real economy emissions reductions. Many of the firms now have set interim science-based targets that are consistent with 1.5 degrees and are now implementing them through comprehensive net zero transition plans, as well as setting out the strategy for achieving these targets. And we expect to start seeing really tangible action as these plans are implemented, with progress as part of regular reporting as well. So on this chart, we're kind of in this middle section, we hope, and hopefully that's a good place to be, but everyone always wants us to be at the far end, so we're getting there. last year, we worked with practitioners and partners to develop a framework in collaboration with various related initiatives and drawing together key existing work to establish a framework really for transition planning that can guide financial institutions in different areas of the financial sector, but importantly that they can use this framework as well with their clients in the real economy to set expectations of what they'd like to see in terms of a strategy for the net zero transition. Now, it doesn't seem unreasonable if you're lending, investing, insuring a business, that they set out how they're going to manage the risks from and seize the opportunities of the sort of seismic scale of economic change that the net zero transition represents. The sustainable revolution of completely reworking our energy, transport, industrial processes really is going to be on the scale of the industrial revolution, but needs to be done at the speed of the digital revolution. So we do think this is really significant stuff. And to this end, GFANZ has tried to develop guidance for those financial institutions and companies that centers on 4 strategies. The first 2 in this diagram are perhaps obvious: financing the climate solutions and financing those companies already aligned with science-based net zero pathways. And I really like that one of those final charts, as Rachel pointed out, because it really gets at some of this issue. The third bucket then is similarly in that transition space. These are the folks that we're calling aligning, who are on their way to kind of joining that pathway. But the key thing here is that we need strategies that go to where the emissions are, back those companies that are developing credible transition plans to get them down. And if that's not possible, that gets us into this 4th bucket of managing the phase out of assets that are naturally going to be stranded by the net zero transition. So how do we deal with those in an orderly way? And in this way, that the GFANZ framework makes clear that transition finance isn't about or is about driving, decarbonisation in the real economy, and not simply retreating to the sort of false comfort of financial portfolio decarbonisation. The world can't divest our way to net zero. We have to invest in the solutions in those companies that are transitioning to grow our way there. And that requires going where those emissions are, backing the companies with credible transition plans. And to promote accountability on all of this, we're helping create net zero public data utility that, once operational later this year, is going to help provide consistent, accurate, openly available climate transition related information that anyone can use to track climate progress. Now, the transition planning framework is being picked up in the official sector institutions as well. Earlier this week, many of you will notice the inaugural standards from the International Sustainability Standards Boards came out and referenced the need for transition planning disclosures, as does TCFD, which was largely based on. And the ideal next step is that we get a sort of consensus around the global level of what a common approach to delivering transition plans look like, followed by hopefully national implementation of that. And a number of countries are moving towards that national implementation already. In the UK, we have the Transition Plan Task Force, perhaps being the clearest to date, and they are leveraging the GFANZ framework. And in the same way, many countries using ISSB, which will apply in about 120 countries for their climate disclosure requirements. So this is all very exciting, I think. And the reason I think this is important, because this emerging net zero financial system can really help drive action. So first of all, net zero committed investors have this ability really to pull forward action from policymakers by helping demonstrate what's needed. Now, this chart shows investor targets drawn from the Net Zero Asset Manager Initiative, and it shows they're poised for emissions reductions at rates twice as fast as what policy is implying. And so this is helping put pressure on government policy to move faster and demonstrate where the particular challenges are in meeting those. At the same time, we see private finance becoming a multiplier for the transition. And this chart shows how you get these valuation premiums accorded to companies that are outperforming when it comes to decarbonisation. Now, one of the things I suppose last year was the energy crisis prompted by the invasion of Ukraine. Many commentators were suggesting that maybe we were seeing a new movie as the oil empire strikes back, given the the massive earnings that those companies made. And you can see in this chart that sort of pure valuation premium is falling towards the end of the chart here. But when we look at the energy sector through the lens of transition planning, which is what we're trying to focus on, good plans being something that financial institutions can back, you see that those companies with higher quality transition plans in the blue line here outperformed those with weaker ones. And over the course of last year, and this is the energy sector, that equates to about 20 percentage points of return difference. So it really is quite marketable. Finally then, so to conclude, I think through transition planning, I really think we're starting to make progress here. We have the commitments, we have increasingly the targets that surround them, and as these plans are made and start moving from the exception to the norm across the financial system and the broader economy, we'll increasingly be able to see tangible progress here. And transparency and scrutiny of that will combine and help create this feedback loop that this diagram's aiming to show between the ambition of financial institutions and companies and pushing for more ambitious and credible climate policies, and that further then catalyze the private investment to come behind that. So a new net zero financial sectors helping amplify impact, going where those emissions are, dealing with those transition traps and rewarding market leaders that drive investment forward. Colleagues who were in Paris last week for the summit there hosted by President Macron have come home in buoyant mood this week, not from the reverie of the Fête de la Musique, but the huge momentum that's now building for reform of our international financial architecture as well, that's designed to kind of support this feedback loop. So the imperative, it feels, of catalyzing private finance through clear and credible policy and plans is really starting to take center stage. So thank you very much for joining the session today, and look forward to questions later.
Excellent, Rana, thank you so much. And your point on the need for a supportive policy system to enable these financial flows links again beautifully with our next speaker, Leo, who is going to talk about that very subject. And it's the sustainable finance policy tools that can drive money towards the transition. So we have some questions coming into the Q&A now. We'll get to them at the end, but please do continue to drop your questions into the Q&A, and we'll make sure that we'll find some time at the end. But over to you, Leo.
Thanks, Rachel. Indeed, very good segue from Roman's session. And yes, sorry about my background. Some technical issues on my side. Didn't want to undermine the consistency with other panelists, but there we go. So hopefully you can all hear me okay. For this part of the event, I just wanted to focus a bit more on how the EU's suite of sustainable finance tools can evolve to unlock these all-important transition finance flows. I think to date, we've seen a lot of developments in the regulatory space, particularly in sustainable finance, and a lot of it, I think, is focused on reorienting capital towards green activities. And this is, of course, really, really important. But for the EU to keep on track with its climate goals and support that whole of economy transition, we really need to accelerate investment, not just in activities and companies that are already green, but in the process of becoming green. And encouragingly, this is a topic that is receiving a lot more attention and looming increasingly large in EU policymakers' minds. We had the renewed sustainable finance strategy that was published back in 2021 that explicitly placed financing the transition at its core. And more recently this month, we also had guidance and a package from the Commission, which has provided a lot of clarity on how existing policies and tools can be used on a voluntary basis to support transition finance and support the energy transition. But there remain a number of areas, I think, where these tools will need to evolve to facilitate investments that support the decarbonisation of the economy, and I'll touch on a few priority actions that we think could help to achieve this. So I think firstly, I think it's going to be important for the EU to establish a clear and consistent definition of transition finance across this sustainable finance regulatory architecture. Definitions of transition finance do vary, but I think at its core, it's obviously about financing these activities that will enable the alignment of corporates across all sectors of the economy to hit that 1.5-degree trajectory. We have seen very recently in this package that I mentioned non-binding definitions of transition finance and transition plans that's been set out by the Commission, and this is really something to be welcomed, but these concepts really do need to be embedded consistently across and between the regulations that underpin the EU sustainable finance framework. The EU taxonomy, for example, does not, I think, at present fully recognise efforts by companies to improve the sustainability performance of their activities. CapEx plans can provide a basis for alignment of activities with climate goals over a time-limited period. And I guess transitional activities as well, of course, are accounted for to some extent within the existing taxonomy framework. But this transitional category, I think, only really captures a small subsection of the economy, namely those activities for which there are as yet no low carbon alternatives. And I think one way that we could address this issue is to potentially extend the taxonomy scope to capture a broader swathe of the economy beyond just those green activities, including significantly harmful activities or red activities, as well as intermediate activities that can transition to a more sustainable level of performance over time. It remains to be seen whether the Commission will take this kind of extended taxonomy forward, but it could certainly, I think, help to provide investors with more clarity over activities whose transition will have the greatest impact on emissions reductions in the real economy, as well as helping companies to secure financing for their transition efforts at the activity level, and potentially even provide the KPIs, a basis for KPIs for some of the innovative products and instruments that were mentioned earlier, use of proceeds transition bonds, for example. I think this lack of clarity around the concept of transition finance is also presenting challenges for financial market participants in the context of the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. I think under SFDR, it does remain somewhat unclear whether the definition of a sustainable investment accommodates for assets that are in transition or only assets that are already green. Some of the recent guidance that the Commission has issued has left some room for manoeuvre for investors to classify transitioning assets as sustainable, but given the urgent need to facilitate investment in the companies whose transition is most essential for reaching net zero, which have credible plans to align with net zero, I think this regime could evolve further to better recognise transition-focused investment strategies as an essential approach to sustainable investing. And lastly, just on this kind of point, turning to the low carbon benchmarks regulation, I think tools like the Paris Line benchmarks, climate transition benchmarks have definitely provided investors with a helpful means of tailoring their portfolios in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement, but in their current form, they lack the flexibility to allow for investment in high emitters with credible transition plans. They adopt a bit of a one-size-fits-all approach that doesn't recognise the very different starting points and trajectories for transition across sectors. And this is something IOGCC published a paper on quite recently. We looked at how these benchmarks can prioritise real-world organic emissions reductions rather than prioritising paper decarbonisation that was mentioned earlier by Ronan through a reallocation of capital to low carbon sectors. Secondly, I think it's going to be absolutely essential to ensure that robust mandatory transition plan requirements are placed at the heart of the EU sustainable finance regime. These credible and comparable transition plan disclosures are going to be absolutely essential for informing investment decisions and reorienting capital. And the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the standards that underpin that, the ESRS, are the main tools for embedding these plans in the regulatory architecture. But I think there are several gaps in the EU's reporting regime that could make it challenging for investors to access this information on a widespread and consistent basis. So, for example, under CSRD, companies are only required to disclose transition plans if they have them already. If they don't, they can opt to explain why this is not the case. And I think this could be further aggravated by recent proposals from the Commission to move away from mandatory reporting of key climate indicators under these detailed European sustainability reporting standards. That wouldn't be ideal from our perspective to promote the widespread availability of information. So I think really going to be important to ensure that investors can really assess the credibility of corporate transition plans on a widespread basis by making these disclosure regimes mandatory, and also making them coherent with transition plan requirements across other key regulations. So, for example, the forthcoming Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, that sets out proposals for mandatory adoption of transition plans by companies in scope, but if investors don't have transparency on the adoption of these plans, because companies aren't then obliged to report on them, then that creates an inconsistency in the framework. So we really do need to close, I think, this comply or explain loophole in the architecture in the EU and support that end-to-end coherency of the EU's regulatory framework by maintaining a consistent approach to transitioning across and between these regulatory files, ensuring that they complement rather than duplicate or even worse, contradict one another. And lastly, I think really, really important to note that policy tools will need to send the right price signals to financial markets to really accelerate the flow of finance towards the transition, towards the energy transition. The sustainable finance regulation that we've seen over the last few years has really helped to increase transparency around climate risks and opportunities. It's a critical prerequisite for informing investment decisions, but ultimately it is a means to an end. We need to create an enabling environment to green the financial system, but this has to go hand in hand with real economy policies that convey strong price signals to the market, essentially just by making sustainable investments cheaper and harmful investments more expensive. We need these policies that will price negative externalities, that create pricing mechanisms, carbon taxes, as well as comprehensive industrial strategies that support the decarbonisation of heavy emitting sectors and boost renewable productions. This will provide the strongest incentive of all for investors to reorient capital. And I think in this context, the EU's Green Deal Industrial Plan is, of course, a really welcome development. It makes funding a core pillar of the plan, and this should provide much needed financial support for the transition of hard to abate sectors, while also tackling those barriers to investment in renewables. But at present, the plan is primarily focused on public financing tools. It's not as transparent around the role of the private financial markets. It's really going to be essential that we address this and crowd in private finance and ensure that these huge investment gaps, something along the lines of 700 billion in additional annual investment that's going to be needed a year to meet the goals of the European Green Deal. And we need to close that gap by crowding in private finance, providing mechanisms that support investors' needs and enable them to fund an economy-wide transition. Don't have a huge amount of time left, I believe, but just thought I'd summarize really briefly and before I hand over. I think it's hopefully very clear to everyone that the EU has shown a lot of ambition and leadership in building out sustainable finance policy tools that have really helped to increase disclosure and transparency over climate risks and opportunities that can provide a basis for reorienting capital in line with the transition. But we do need to complement the existing focus on financing green with a greater recognition of transition finance and really embed this consistently throughout the EU's regulatory architecture for sustainable finance. And I think critically as well, we're going to need to ensure that there's a holistic approach to transition finance, creating those joined up feedback loops with real economy and sectoral policies as well, to let those transition finance flow at scale. And I think hopefully a good basis for handing over to Sveti after that, but look forward to questions later.
Thank you so much, Leo. That actually links back nicely to Ronan's presentation, as well as forward to Sveti's, because you mentioned the need for disclosure, and obviously the Net Zero Data Public Utility Platform, I might have got that acronym wrong, is all about enabling comparability of information as disclosed by companies. So that's a fantastic link. And obviously the presentation from Sveti is going to touch on subsidies. Now, you mentioned the need to crowd in private finance, and the role of subsidies in doing that, I think, is a really important one. And we're seeing it, very strong signals in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, and obviously with the EU, they're also attempting to encourage financial flows through the use of public money. So, Sveti, I'll hand over to you. And again, we do have some questions trickling in. We'll have some time at the end. We'll have about 30 minutes, 20 or 30 minutes at the end to speak to those. So please do continue to put your questions in the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. I have the pleasure and the burden to go last, and especially after Leo, with whom we do share our work on similar topics in the EU regulatory landscape. So I'll try to provide a little bit of background and to try to zoom us out a little bit from the financial regulatory space and to really see what this means in the broader context of where the global financial landscape is heading to, and ideally bring us back a little bit to the energy financing specifically. So with this, I just wanted to start with so-called tectonic shifts that are happening currently in Europe. And we already have some estimates that the clean tech market is almost doubling every year, and it's expected to be 650 billion by 2030. So we do see a lot of investments in the clean tech sector, but at the same time, we do have those critical moments in Europe with the war in Ukraine, the rising inflation, and the gas prices. So this is really what we call a tectonic shift in Europe of how to tackle both the geopolitical dimension of energy dependencies in Europe and how to respond to the amount of subsidies that are being poured in the clean energy sectors, both from the US through the Inflation Reduction Act, but also in other places in the world, specifically here. I have given an example with the solar power, where China is expected to be China is among the main supplier in the global market and exposes yet another vulnerability to European markets here. With this, I wanted to give you an example of where the financial flows in solar manufacturing specifically are, because solar is among the energy sources and investments that is really driving the clean investments in Europe and globally as well. In this graph, what do you think, this is a separation by regions and different jurisdictions, and where do you think the investments in Europe are? In that scale, it's this tiny blue bit here. So comparatively, it is a very small amount of investments. And the orange one is China, which comparatively, when we look at the investments in solar manufacturing, is much bigger than the rest of the world. So Europe, comparatively to India, China, but also to North America, is actually a very small amount of investments. This is a little bit of older data, pre-announcements of the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the new investments in clean technology. But just to give you a sense of what the dynamic of what the combination of public versus private investments in the world are for green investments. And as you can see, over 50, more than half is for renewable energy, and of this, the majority goes to solar as well. So an interesting dynamic, obviously in East Asia, the focus has been on public investments, and now we are seeing a similar dynamic also in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act. That being said, Europe is still a very prominent place for investments in clean energy. Comparatively, in the global investments of new power, you can see that the renewable energy is much more significant for new investments. And also I have put here some information on the green bond market, which has reached an important milestone last year. But Europe is still the biggest issuer of green bonds. And as you can see here, the yellow, bright orange color is the amount of proceeds that go to renewable energy. So it's still quite significant amount. The most of the biggest investments from the proceeds of green bonds go still into renewable energy as well. So as I said, we are entering the stage of the subsidy race. I do feel that it's a very unhelpful way of framing it, but this is just the reality we are dealing with, and the amount of public investments going into certain sectors is quite substantial. This is just a big quick snapshot of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. And as you can see, the clean energy is one of the most prominent areas where investments, where subsidies are supposed to go. On that backdrop, the EU announced the Green Deal Industrial Plan and consecutively the Net Zero Industry Act of the European response to what to expect from Europe on that front, and it's a mixed bag of different requirements. We do see some relaxation of state aid, for instance, reshuffling of a lot of the existing EU funds, and we did expect a very serious proposition of new money. This is what I have outlined here as STEP. It was meant to be a sovereignty fund, but at the moment it has been only 10 billion new funding has been proposed, and the rest is still crowding investments from other existing European funds and sources. But still, the big question is around private investments, and I think Leo also outlined this nicely. There is an identified private investment gap that is not yet exactly clear how it will be funded. The European Union, exactly in the context of GDIP, is relying very heavily on the Capital Markets Union, but we are yet to see how developments in the private sector will unfold in the coming months and years. And here I wanted, before I go directly into some of the financing tools from green to transition finance, to give you a snapshot of the different funding options and mechanisms within the EU. And obviously we need the combination of both public, private, and EU funds, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. The majority of clean investments are actually through European funds, and reliance on capital market is not as strong, where the financing system is more bank-based and loan-based. But we do have a huge investment gap to be filled by the private sector as well. And energy, again, is the most prominent, with 75% of the total emissions in the EU. That being said, the EU, the European Union, the European Commission are very inconsistent in how much public money can leverage, how much private. So there are different coefficients that for different sectors can be estimated, but definitely the leverage of private investments through some of the EU funds and public is the goal of the EU going forward as well. With this, going directly into the private sector needs, and Leo already outlined this nicely also with the taxonomy and some of the gaps there. I just wanted to show you here how the first initial thinking of the EU focus on green finance, defining green, is related to the whole sustainable finance system and how it affects everything from disclosure and reporting for transparency tools to really different labeling schemes, including the EU Green Bond Standard, but could also translate, and we have seen some marginal application to also European funds like the RRF, the do no significant harm of the taxonomy has been used there, EIB and public banks policies as well, but also potentially for state aid, and some countries, some member states are even applying it to tracking it for national budgets of how green they are. So the taxonomy has been like one of the first, and CBI as well have been instrumental behind some of the European Union's thinking on creating and setting up the taxonomy. But it has also underlined this gap of how much we have been focusing on green and investing in green, and we really need to start thinking about transition finance. And I think among some developments around the world, the EU has started picking up the signals and has started also working on transition planning and transition finance elements. Leo already covered a lot of these developments, but I wanted just to give you a snapshot of where we have different elements of transition planning and transition finance, the transitioning element within the EU financial regulatory landscape. And as you can see, it is a lot, and it's emerging in different types of regulation. And especially with this subsidy race narrative that we have at the moment, what we get from businesses, the most common questions and response to all this is that it is a lot of regulatory burden and a lot of compliance requirements in which European businesses are finding it very difficult to stay afloat and to really maintain their competitiveness in the global markets. Just to outline here, the big stars of the transition planning regulation are the first one, ESRS, the reporting standards, where there are some outline requirements for what transition plans should look like. And obviously the second one, CSDDD, of due diligence requirements, where we still in the making, but where we expect mandatory transition plans. And as mentioned previously, we already see that there is a lot to be desired in a lot of these developments. In the EU taxonomy on the benchmark is the last one here. There is a lot more that can be desired, but I think the main takeaway here is that the EU already has this regulatory framework in place, and we do see in it also the Brussels effect of foreign companies that operate within the EU market also having to comply with it. So with the ESRS, for instance, around 10,000 companies outside of the EU will have to report. With the CSDDD, it's not clear yet, but around 4,000 is the initial estimation of foreign companies. So we do see that a lot of the regulatory space is based on transparency, but would also affect companies outside of the EU as well. And I think the big takeaway there is that we are focusing a lot on on transparency and reporting. And so the next big step, I think, will be for businesses to take really this as an opportunity of having a lot of this information and data and using it to create their credible transition plans for their businesses, to really use this as their advantage to future-proof their business models for the transition, not only in Europe, but in the global value chains as well. With that being said, I think I also want to touch upon some of the recent announcements by the European Commission. Leo also mentioned them, but the DG FISMA has already identified this as a gap in the sustainable finance framework of the EU, that there is not enough focus on transition finance, and we have focused a lot on green. So there has been a non-legislative text proposed recently. So we do see a lot of this thinking of how the existing framework can be used to incentivize the transition and where some of the gaps can be filled. But you can see here the dynamic between green finance and transition finance, and how over time in the long term we need to see that incremental change from transition finance into green finance. And on the right-hand side, how different existing tools within the EU framework can be used to incentivize that transition as well. I'm already concluding. I just wanted to show you in the end also how the taxonomy, which is a very EU tool that has, again, also its ripple effects around the world, but how it can also help the transition planning that is entity level, while the taxonomy is focusing on activities. But there is this correlation, and the EU, the European Commission, do recognize the role that taxonomy and all the information of disclosing against the taxonomy will play in transitioning businesses through their different activities, including on the energy transition, among other activities as well. So to conclude with this, I wanted to show you what the E3G's thinking on the matter is. And you have seen that there are a lot of developments, but the whole transition finance landscape is quite patchy, and there are bits and pieces emerging in different pieces of legislation. And even for businesses, it's very difficult to keep up with everything and to disclose against everything. So what is currently needed from our perspective is really to to bring everything into the coherent transition finance framework, to bring together both subsidy, EU financing, national budgets of different countries with the private sector incentives, and to really create a more coherent transition finance framework that should operate obviously at all different levels. And here are some recommendations of what the transition planning could look like at the EU, national and entity level, and how this can all work together to ensure a more orderly, let's say, transition in the EU. With that, I will conclude, but I'm happy to take any questions. I know I flicked through some of the slides very quickly, so happy to elaborate on some of them as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sveti. That's been really helpful. It's very interesting that you mentioned most of the work to date has focused on disclosure and reporting. And that is now enabling the companies that need to, which essentially is all companies, but starting with the big ones anyway, to develop these transition plans because they have the data for all of their scopes, because one company's scope 1 and scope 2 is another company's scope 3, and transition plans obviously need to include all those scopes. So the more reporting and disclosure happens, the better that we can expect to see the transition plans in line with the tools that, for example, Ana Diaz is developing on the pathways. So we've kind of come full circle with the pathways and through the transition plans and the finance mechanisms and the policy. And we have a number of questions in the chat that I'm going to read out and direct to different people. So the first question that came through the chat, I'm going to direct this to Ana Diaz because it was one of the early questions. So this is from Madhvi Agaval, and apologies if I have pronounced that wrong. Is the criteria around phasing out of oil and gas-fired plants, coal-fired refineries, etc., location and country-based, or are they planning to be global criteria? So this one I'm going to direct to you, Anna. If others want to jump in, please do feel free.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. This is a very interesting question. We are dealing with that at the technical working group. We want to make the criteria as simple as possible, and given the magnitude of the transformation that we have ahead and we don't have time, there's not really much room. I would say 5 years more or less in order to reach this or this goal. So there's not much room in terms of time. So we will go probably for maximum 2 geographies, no more than that, in order to be simplified, to simplify the criteria, pretty much.
Is there anything anyone else would like to add to that? Or shall I jump over to the next question, which I will be directing to Ronan? And this is about the relationship between GFANZ and the multilateral development bank. So what is that relationship? How do you work with those MDBs?
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, I think a quick text response to this as well, people can see, but I mean, finance on the scale that's going to be required implies using a significant amount of public money to catalyze large multiples of private capital, and GFANZ represents that private financial sector and what it needs. And so that means that those providers of public finance, it could be donor governments, development finance institutions, multilateral development banks, must find ways to deploy, pool, lend risk capital with private finance at greater scale and do that more flexibly. So we're really encouraging the multilateral development banks and their shareholder governments to do that, to align financing. And we saw some progress on that last week, I think, in particular to set net zero targets, raise expectations of what their role is and strengthen their mandates to do more with their resources in this regard. Because, I mean, let's be clear, climate change is a key developmental issue. So it'd be odd if they weren't doing this, I think. But to support that, the role of GFANZ really is to help with that bridge and indicate, well, what is it that is going to bring in private finance, what's bringing in the global private financial institutions to work with multilateral development banks and others to do that? What are the risks that private finance finds difficult, but some of these other organizations find more straightforward. The IMF's better at managing currency risk in developing economies than a lot of private financial institutions, for example. So how can we draw on those comparative advantages, I suppose, of different folks to then basically make an environment that works for bringing in private finance to these situations? And so one example of that we're very actively involved in is working through the Just Energy Transition Partnerships in Indonesia and Vietnam, and other ones announced last week in Senegal, that aim to catalyze a more ambitious decarbonisation in those countries. And it really is about a partnership between local finance, global private finance, global public finance, the institutions, utilities, etc. in those countries, of how can we actually make this work, and how do we bring those different forms of finance together so that you get a solution. And it's that catalytic role that's the nature of our relationship with them.
Thank you. That does actually link to a question that just came in that I'll throw open, but I'll ask Sveti if she has any thoughts on it first, which is, are there any thoughts around using blended finance approaches for the EU and developed countries to catalyse transition financing? So this is quite topical with the Paris summit that happened recently. So Sveti, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, indeed, blended finance is quite important, and I think the EU also recognizes it, especially in different member states. It can play quite a prominent role. And as I mentioned in my presentation, a lot of the focus in some countries is really on the EU financing. And there is also this notion of how much, where we have seen through the recovery funds, for example, that a lot of the money poured into those economies have been on the basis of grants. And we have seen, for example, with the energy efficiency and improving the energy efficiency of building, some of those measures, a lot of the money, and in the energy sector altogether, the majority has been on grants and not so much financial instruments. And this has actually led to the realization that this inflates quite significantly the technology and the markets, and is increasing the prices. So definitely at the moment, not as not as prominent, but definitely both the European Commission and different countries are coming to the realization that there needs to be a lot more blended finance to achieving transitioning goals and targets.
If I may just hop in there, completely agree with everything Sveti says, and I appreciate obviously the main focus of this event is very much the EU, but I think one area that we really shouldn't ignore is just the absolutely essential role of these kind of blended finance mechanisms for the emerging and developing markets as well, right? I think it's something along the lines of 70% of all the investment we're going to need globally to get to net zero is going to have to take place in non-OECD regions, developing regions, and the EU as a bloc is going to be an essential partner in financing that. But there's a huge amount of kind of risks at present that all investors are risk averse to channeling finance into these areas, particularly in the context of energy development. So I think that it's a really important mechanism in that sense as well, and I think it's something that the EU and others need to think about, how to work with multilateral development banks and the public sector, how we can combine that kind of like de-risking mechanism that the public sector can provide with that private sector capital to make sure it goes to the areas of the world where it really needs to go to achieve that maximum impact on emissions reductions. So I think it's certainly important in the EU, but given how developed the market is and how much of the financing is already coming from the private sector, really important to think about it in that emerging markets context as well.
Thanks, Leo. And there's a question in the chat that actually relates to this, which is, do you know which Asian countries are leading on transition finance frameworks? Now, there's a few that are very active. Japan springs to mind as being very active in the transition finance market. And the ASEAN taxonomy has just come out for public consultation, and that includes transition elements. So fully agree that transition is global. I'd say Asia is very much leading the way in terms of pushing for frameworks, particularly with Japan coming out with government guidance on the transition. And Ronan, I noticed that you just
I'd give a
unmuted.
shout out to Singapore as well, who've
Oh yes, of course.
announced that they're putting transition planning into their supervisory expectations for financial institutions in that area, and they're developing a taxonomy closely aligned with the ASEAN one as well. So lots of really forward-leaning work in that country.
And on that one, some of their consultation came out yesterday for Singapore as well, including coal phase-out work. So people are interested in contributing to that consultation. Now's a great time to look for that.
Yeah, just a plug for climate bonds there. We're advising both of those. So a question for yourself, Anna, actually moving away from the regional questions, which is how does the climate bond standard handle entity level certification? And they mention power utilities divesting of fossil fuels, but I think it's generally applicable is how does the standard handle entity divestment rather than early decommissioning or phase out or other ways of decarbonising?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, this one, and I know there's divided opinions about it. So basically, as I said at the beginning, we have criteria that work at the level of measures or projects. So we are going to be developing criteria for sort of coal phase out, early phase out should be. I want to stress that it needs to be early phase out. So we would support finance, obviously, for early phase out of some of these fossil fuel activities and assets. But when you look at a corporate level of somebody who has got fossil fuel activities and building up their renewables, as a general rule, our view is we would allow them to either divest or phase out these things, and we wouldn't put prescriptions on it to say, actually, we would only certify you if you were going to phase it out as opposed to you've divested it, because we want to look at actually what they've got in their portfolio. There's a very interesting question here about, obviously for policymakers, we want to see them supporting a whole shift about how much of that we put on the corporate to do that phase out activity. But I don't want to give it as a red line, because actually I was going to also pass that to Anna to see if this topic has come up with the TWG in its current discussions about, whether it should actually require phase out or whether we would keep our general principle of we would allow for a corporate level divestment or phase out. Yeah. Does that come up, Anna?
Yes, of course it has come out, because at the last technology report from the IEA, the 23, they clearly say that if we want to have any chance to reach 1.5, there's no way we will do it with the capacity of coal that we have it today, and to leave this capacity to the lifespan to the end. So clearly some capacity, coal capacity, need to phase out. And I mentioned briefly that in my presentation. So we need to phase that coal power plants early. So first the low efficient one, and then we go increasing up to the supercritical one from the low subcritical one. But of course, this is not an easy task. And that's why I mentioned that we need to be careful that not only substitute by renewables with renewable the generation capacity, but also the services that this type of thermal power plant which are very stable and stabilize the grids, and also different services that are not really, they cannot really be provided by the renewable. They should be provided somewhere else, like with smart grid, with storage, etc. So this should be done, and this is included into the criteria, but of course with some caveat regarding the stability of the grid.
Thanks, Anna. Anna Creed, anything else to add on that one? Or
no, I'm good. Yeah, I think it's just a tricky question about where we obviously need to phase the stuff out, but really where the responsibility for that lies is the tricky part to answer, and therefore what you put on. And that will make it interesting as well. Sorry, probably just to add to that is when we develop the criteria for sovereigns, what we'll say for sovereign entities in these kind of measures might actually, sorry, not measures, in this respect might be quite different. And there we might have to look at not just about what they're encouraging, what they're prohibiting, also their own role in subsidies of fossil fuels. So we might look at that as well. So in the public entity space, it might have quite a more stringent set of requirements. But again, that becomes difficult for some regions around the world. So we're just going to have to navigate that when we get to sovereign certification as well. Yeah.
It's such an interesting space.
Sorry, Rachel, if I may add, there will be phasing out, but there will be also repurposing and also retrofitting. So there are different possibilities, and depending on the geography, the investment that we need, and also where is the state of the nation in terms of electricity mix will be different option. Not only phasing out, but phasing out is required for sure.
Great. I was going to say it's such an interesting space because we're all kind of, I think someone mentioned before to me, we're building the plane as we're flying along because this is such a new area. So it's a fascinating space in which to work. We have a question here that is actually directed to Leo, IIGCC, but it is relevant, I think, to all of the panelists. So I'll throw it open, but I'll start with Leo. And the question is, what plans has specifically IIGCC, but everybody, got to engage with the EU on the need for an extended taxonomy and the need for robust reporting standards? So Leo, over to you for that one first. Okay,
so I think, well, hopefully it came through in my presentation, but I think from our perspective, there is value add in a potential extended taxonomy. I think some of the recent clarifications we've seen from the Commission about how the current taxonomy can be used to inform transition finances is helpful, but we need that transparency over the broader economy, both for those assets that are incapable of transitioning and therefore present a risk of becoming stranded as part of the transition, as well as those that can kind of move quite significantly from one harmful level of performance, even if it's not quite up to sustainable. That's still a huge impact on real world emissions reduction. So that's absolutely essential. And I think given that we're embracing the dynamics of the transition so effectively at the entity level through transition plans, arguably we need to anchor those in sector pathways a bit more, but just we're embracing that dynamic at the entity level. And I think we need to go further at the activity level as well. And that's where I think an extended taxonomy has merit, and we will be engaging, I'm sure, on that. And I'm not quite sure where the Commission is with its thinking, but I do think there's a lot of merit in that as well. And I think also it might help to address some of the issues we've seen. So with the current framework, IIGCC in the past has advocated quite strongly against the inclusion of natural gas. Recently we supported investor efforts to highlight the issues with fuel efficient aircraft being included in the taxonomy as well. It's not that these activities don't need finance for their transition, of course they do, but is the green taxonomy the right tool to accommodate them? No, I think it risks crowding out finance for genuinely sustainable activities, but it could be housed within this extended taxonomy. And I think on that basis, given where the EU is with its development of a green taxonomy, there's a lot of merit, and it's something we'll consider in our advocacy. And then on the robust standards point briefly, it's absolutely essential. I mean, I think the recent kind of move away from mandatory disclosure of key climate indicators and towards materiality assessments, particularly for investors with their own mandatory reporting obligations in the EU, is far from ideal, and it's something that we want to engage with stakeholders in Brussels on. It's something that we are working with closely with stakeholders and members on, but clearly we do need a kind of core set of mandatory disclosures which will help to inform investors, assess the credibility of transition plans, meet their own net zero alignment actions, and the fact that we're kind of moving away from that and rolling back that ambition, given the EU has set the bar so high for disclosures, is disappointing. So yeah, completely agreed on both counts of the merit of both of those areas, and we'll certainly be doing all we can at IIGCC to promote that level of ambition that we need.
Yeah, I fully agree that it was not what we wanted to see with the ESRS and the option for choosing your materiality. But I will throw this question on the EU taxonomy open, because both Anna Creed and Sveti have inputs to make. So Anna, you've unmuted. I'll go to you first and then over to Sveti afterwards.
Thank you. I think I left myself unmute. But yeah, the EU taxonomy is a very interesting one. So obviously at the moment, it does include activities that need to transition, more in the industrial hard-to-abate sectors. So there is precedent, it's kind of a sustainability taxonomy for transitional activities, so cement, steel, chemical production, etc. They're all in the EU taxonomy, and they are transitional activities that are high emissions and need to decarbonise. Obviously, the limitation is the EU taxonomy doesn't have forward pathways. So for somebody setting a transition plan and future targets, it doesn't really tell you. Even the kind of the provisions and the regulations to have a capex plan for the next 10 years, that will be docking a capex plan for the next 10 years for criteria set 2 years ago. You need to set your capex plan for the next 10 years for targets that are going to be in place in 10 years' time. Otherwise, we're always working with a 10-year lag here. So the fact there isn't sort of transition pathways in the taxonomy is a bit of a problem for me, but the precedent of having some of those transitional activities in there is great. But obviously at the moment, it only includes really activities, because of its structural nature based on the NACE codes and the activities that we want to see in a 2050 economy. We're going to need cement, we're going to need steel, etc. We're going to need aviation in some form or other, so they have a role to play. What it struggles to capture, obviously, is the fact that we don't cover at all the kind of brown activities, coal production, well, I was going to say gas production, but that's in there now. But these kind of things that actually we need to be phasing down and ramping out. And definitely, I think there is a place to actually identify those activities and start putting criteria on them in the form of sunset dates, in the form of glide paths down. So we definitely need that. But we have got the structural problems still within the taxonomy is actually some of these big players in the fossil fuel industry, what you need them to do is ramp down their fossil fuels at the same time as ramping up their renewables. You could separately evaluate those two components, or you could have an emissions trajectory which takes into the sort of emissions intensity of the average unit of energy being produced. The taxonomy can't really do that because it can't navigate for you how to mix and match different activities that are going to be shifting. I mean, nobody's a pure play, right? And these guys that are going to transition, they're not just saying, I'm going to turn off the lights and cease my business tomorrow. They're going to think of a new activity to do. So they've got a mix of activities going on. So you need that kind of layer on top. So there's definitely more we should explore and use and develop to add to the taxonomy within its existing framework. We need pathways. We also need to add on the activities that need sunset dates and glide paths in a red, amber, wherever we structure it, agree with that. We're also going to have to think somehow outside the taxonomy, how to work out the rule sets. And we see them in the voluntary initiatives that we've got it in ours, IGCC have got something in there. It's about actually when you get complex companies with multiple activities, how do you bring those all together and evaluate them as a whole about whether their movement between activities is right and fast enough. Yeah.
Thanks, Anna. And the balancing of, for example, phase down and ramp up is reflected in the, I think it's the JEP in Indonesia that's talking about how to phase out coal on one hand, early phase out, and how to ramp up renewables to fill that gap on the other hand. So that balancing act's really important. But I will pass over to Sveti now, because I think you wanted to jump in on the taxonomy question as well.
Yes, thank you. And I do agree with what Anna and Leo said. I just wanted to provide a little bit more insights on where that sits in the actual process, the EU legislative process. Technically, the European Commission does have the mandate to produce at least guidance, if not legislative text, under the Sustainable Finance Strategy from the summer of 2021, the European Commission, DG FISMA, have placed their the action and do have the mandate to produce something on the extended framework, meaning amber and red, very much the thinking around it. Now, this was proposed in 2021 when we are having the really difficult conversations about the role of gas and nuclear. So this was seen as part of the political solution to create this extra space for the amber categories where they can go. And since they have already been categorized within the green taxonomy, the green categories, sort of the momentum for this extended taxonomy politically died. And I do not think that we will be seeing anything anytime soon from the Commission in terms of legislative text. Now, that being said, the Platform on Sustainable Finance, the previous one, the first one, produced absolutely brilliant report on that and how the different categories can look like. And why I say this, because green, and obviously Anna also mentioned that the transitional activities within the taxonomy do create some space for using, as we have seen from the Commission's most recent communication, there are merits of how to use the current taxonomy framework for incentivizing the transition. I want to also mention that gas and nuclear are still not, I mean, none of us were happy to see them there, but still the criteria is strict enough because it's time limited and thus to some extent have the limited time frame and transitioning thinking behind it. But what we would really like to see is the red categories to really give indication of what are the really polluting activities. And why I say that the platform report was brilliant and why I think the transition, the extended framework is really needed, Anna briefly touched upon it, is really the transitioning within the categories and between the categories. So really how you go from red to amber to green. And even within those categories, you still have a declining factor for most activities, especially the carbon intensive in industry. So within the activities, even within the green, the amber, the red, you have a declining factor over time. And I think this is nicely captured by the report of the platform. That being said, again, with the political situation, I do not think that we will be seeing this. So I'll be really interested to see how the Singapore and the ASEAN taxonomies that already have this thinking within them are approaching this transitional notion within the activities as well and between the activities.
Thank you so much. Right, we just have 2 minutes left, but there was a question in the chat that I did want to bring in and direct to Ronan very quickly, which is the Just Energy Transition Partnership in Indonesia. How well progressed is this program? So this is going to be, I'm afraid, the last question, then I'll wrap up quickly on that one.
Sure, thank you. So the Indonesian JETP, as we call it, was announced in November last year. It sort of formally got going around the turn of the year. And it's progressing well. There's not tons to say at the moment, but it is this collaboration between the main utility and power producers in Indonesia, the government, the donor countries, I think the US, UK, and others, and the multilateral development banks active there, particularly the Asian Development Bank. And it's really trying to cut through what the transition looks like for the power sector in Indonesia, which, if you know, is very coal dominated and they're a big exporter of coal themselves. So how do they manage that transition in a just way? So it's a good kind of example of all the issues that arise with transition, I'd say. And so it's been a great way to sort of figure those out, I suppose. But it is a challenge. And in terms of lessons learned, the key thing I'd say so far is that the thing that's given it a lot of traction is it is brought together all the key ministries in the Indonesian government and their private sector in such a way that there is a real sort of cooperative sense of how they achieve the climate goals that are around that. In other situations, we've seen if you don't bring in the energy ministry, the finance ministry, and so forth, along with an environment ministry, you just run into roadblocks constantly. And so that's a key lesson learned, I think, so far. But more progress to be said on that in coming months.
Great. So we're at time now. I'm going to say thank you so much to all of the panelists who have given up their time to speak today, and for the people who gave up their time to listen and to ask questions. It's been really helpful, really interesting. What's very clear to me is that there is a lot of progress being made, but it seems still that the progress is a little bit slower than it needs to be. So we've got the disclosure, we've got the reporting, but what we're not seeing and what we really need to translate this into is these ambitious transition plans that are being implemented, that we're seeing progress against these performance targets, against pathways such as Anna Diaz is creating, and certification against standards such as Anna Creed is creating, and the guidance that's being provided by all of these organizations, E3G and GFANS and IIGCC, Climate Bonds, others. There's a lot out there. There's a lot being done. It's very positive, but we still need to, as Sean Kidney, our CEO, always says, we need to run, not walk. So I will say thank you very much to everyone. The webinar, I think, is being recorded and will be available on YouTube afterwards. And yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.